Yale, Dartmouth, MIT, they've all reinstated the SAT. Let's take a look at the data that led them to this decision. Let's break it down. This first chart looks at the connection between SAT and ACT scores and college grades. And what this shows us is that a student attending an elite college who enters with a 1200 on the SAT or an equivalent score on the ACT, we can reasonably predict that that student will have around a 3.1 GPA in college. Moving further down the line, a student at a 1400 or an equivalent score on the ACT will have a GPA that's a bit higher in this 3.3 to 3.5 range. And then students who enter an elite college with an SAT score between 1500 and 1600 or 33 and 36 on the ACT, when we look at their college GPAs, we see a very tight link. These kids have strong grades at those elite colleges, often with GPAs between 3.6 and 3.8. Now let's look at the other half of the chart. This looks at the correlation between high school GPA and college grades. The first thing to notice is that this is a pretty flat line. If we contrast that with what we saw with the SAT and ACT scores, this is a very steep line. And in statistics speak, the steeper the line, the tighter the connection between the two variables you're testing. So in this case, we've got a much tighter connection between standardized test scores and college grades than we do between high school grades and college grades. And this tracks with what we've heard recently from Yale, from Dartmouth, from MIT. Standardized test scores have become the #1 predictor of grades in college. This is a big deal if you run an elite school, because part of your mission is to achieve excellence for your students. You want to see kids coming into the school that will earn high grades at that college. And if standardized tests have become the #1 predictor of grades in college, you can bet that college admissions officers are going to put a lot of weight on standardized test scores in the future. Okay, this next chart we're going to look at examines the connection between test scores and job placement after college and graduate school placement after college. First thing to notice, we've got steep lines here, again, for the standardized test scores and very flat lines for high school GPA. So as we learned in the last slide, that means standardized test scores are, again, a better predictor than high school grades of the two things we're testing for. In this case, attending an elite graduate school or working at a prestigious firm after you graduate from that college. So in this case, the student with a 1300 has a 4 to 5% chance of attending an elite graduate school. Whereas students that are in this 1500 to 1600 point range, we're looking at 20 to 25% odds of them attending an elite graduate school. That is showing serious predictive power of standardized test scores. We see an even tighter correlation when it comes to working at a prestigious firm after college. We can draw 3 conclusions. Standardized test scores are now better predictors than high school grades of your grades in college, job placement after college, and graduate school placement after college. This is a really big deal because these are the 3 main ways that colleges judge the success of their students as they move through their college. But one of the biggest complaints about standardized test scores is that they disadvantage students from underperforming schools. So let's take a look at that next. Okay, so again, we're looking at college grades going up here, standardized test scores getting higher as we move to the right. We've got advantaged schools and disadvantaged schools, and you'll notice that these lines are extremely similar. What does that mean? It means that students with strong standardized test scores perform well in college and earn strong grades, regardless of if they attended an advantaged high school or a disadvantaged high school. And this is one of the main reasons cited by MIT, Dartmouth, and Yale on why they've reinstated test scores. They want college admissions to be fair and transparent. They don't want kids from disadvantaged high schools to be disadvantaged in this process. And granted, there are many people that hire a firm like mine at Test Prep Gurus to help their kids raise their SAT and ACT scores. And this brings me to a very important point. I know for a fact that the SAT and the ACT are not intelligence tests or great measurements for a student's capacity for future learning. But what these tests do reward is grit, hard work, perseverance, And that's where the predictive power of the SAT and the ACT come from. Because students who put in the time and the energy and find the right people to guide them to higher scores do the same thing when they get to college. They're better able to overcome the obstacles to earning strong grades, graduating on time, getting admitted to elite graduate institutions and prestigious firms. Now, this brings us to our most interesting piece of data, the last one. And this is where we're going to figure out how test-optional colleges actually interpret SAT and ACT scores. Let's take a look. So we're looking at the share of students admitted to Dartmouth College by test scores and student advantage. So again, we've got SAT and ACT scores moving from left to right. And over here is the admissions percentage for those students. So students with scores that are below 1,300 often see an admissions rate 5% or lower. I mean, it's really tough to get in with a score in that range. And this roughly tracks with the admissions percentage at Dartmouth for test optional students. But as students score above 1,300 and above 1,400, we can see this really take off in terms of the admissions percentage. So students who are scoring 1,500 or higher are often admitted 20 to 25% of the time. This is an incredible increase in an admissions percentage. So what we can see is when a student applies to Dartmouth, test optional or with a low SAT or ACT score, they're rejected about 95 out of 100 times. But incredibly, when they apply to this Ivy League school with a strong SAT or ACT score, they're admitted 1 out of 4 times. Now, there's one other thing on this chart I would note. We've got the orange line are disadvantaged students and the gray line are advantaged students. And you're going to notice there's a gap between these two lines. And what this means is students from advantaged high schools are expected to score a bit higher than students from disadvantaged high schools. Okay, final thought. And this is an important one because this applies to all of the elite and selective colleges that are test optional. Remember, this data we just looked at was taken from Dartmouth last year when they were test optional. And essentially, as scores went up, the admissions rate skyrocketed for those students. So if you're applying to any selective test optional college, don't make the mistake of thinking test optional means test unimportant. And if you're coming from an advantaged high school, they're going to expect a little bit higher scores. But that's okay. The main point is that if you want to be in control of this part of the process, you want to up your odds to be admitted to some of these elite colleges, it's tough to beat the return on investment from putting the time and energy into your SAT and ACT scores going forward.